All right, let's just go ahead, jump on in. Final chapter, chapter 23. This is the Great Depression. So let's start off here. The Great Depression in the United States following the 1929 crash was a severe and prolonged economic crisis. The crash led to a halt in borrowing and buying, causing industries to sell fewer goods and retails to lower prices. This resulted in layoffs and a downward cycle. 4 years later, the Depression reached its lowest point with high unemployment rates and struggling farmers. People depleted their savings, sought public assistance, and defaulted on debt. Banks closed, exacerbating the economic downturn. Despite attempted remedies such as higher tariffs and immigration restrictions, the economy continued to decline. Also, to note, this was really particularly devastating in certain communities, Mexican American communities, the Chinese communities, the Black American communities. Why? Because they were largely excluded from, using the banks, the regular bank systems, or, they were marginalized. So many times they had their own community banks, right? And all of those, with what happened with the Depression, that's where a lot of your closures came from banks. In the 1932 presidential election, Franklin D. Roosevelt promised a New Deal, and we're definitely going to talk about the New Deal, which led to his victory and a transformation in the U.S. government. While the New Deal did not fully meet expectations, it significantly changed Americans' perception of their own country. So let's talk about the origins of the Great Depression. Let's get that set here. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, stock market prices suddenly plummeted, right? $10 billion in investment, which would be 10 times that today, like $100 billion, disappeared in a matter of hours. Leading bankers like J.P. Morgan to raise millions of dollars in personal contributions to try and halt the slide. And then we had what's called Black Tuesday. Notice how everything bad is always called black. Okay, so Black Tuesday on October 29th, 1929, the stock market plummeted all day. They even claimed that J.D. Rockefeller lost 80% of his wealth in a single day. And if you believe that, I have a lovely bridge I'd like to sell you in a little city called Brooklyn, okay? This was, again, all orchestrated very early on for some very specific reasons, but we'll get to that a little bit later. The stock market's collapse did not cause the Great Depression, but exposed the weaknesses in the overall American economy. Of course, if everything is on credit, and there's really not true money being moved, it's just the illusion of money, being moved, through society, it's being inflated, and when that bubble bursts, you do have a crash. That's just how it is. Rising inequality, declining demand, rural collapse, overextended investors, and the bursting of the speculative bubbles all conspired to plunge the nation into the Great Depression. The pro-business policies of the 1920s favored the wealthy, leading to a growing wealth gap. If you could believe that, the wealth gap grew even larger. Okay, you did see a little bit of expansion in the earlier part of the 1920s and the earlier part of the 1900s, with kind of an expansion, a little bit of the upper middle class and middle classes, but that was very, very short-lived. By the time the 1920s rolled around, a lot of that progress kind of halted. You went right back to the area prior to that, like the late 1800s, where we saw, like under the monopolies, where 10% of the population controlled 90% of the wealth, and really about 2% of that 10% held the majority even of that. So average Americans saw a 10% increase in wealth in the 1920s, but the wealthy saw a 75% increase. So like I said, even though, yes, there was some movement or expanding for the regular Americans to kind of move up, like we talked about some industries like the marketing industry and things like that. So while there was definitely growth and some opportunities for advancement economically, the vast majority of that increase went to the wealthy. Okay, low corporate and personal taxes, easy credit, and depressed interest rates overwhelmingly favored wealthy investors who, flush with cash, spent their money on luxury goods and speculative investments in the rapidly rising stock markets. So you've got people now who have all this little extra money, so they're buying all these luxury items, causing a demand for more luxury items to be produced. And then they're using their money to invest in, companies and things that are rising. So just like we talked about Edison and at Menlo Park and I'm going to come up with an invention every 10 days. Well, as those are being developed, they need investors to money behind them to bring them to market. And so that's where some of that speculative investment came from. Okay, so what is speculation? Investing in stocks, property, business ventures, all in the hopes that the value will rise, but also with the potential to lose money. Because again, you're creating stuff where stuff never existed before. So we don't know, is it going to soar or is it going to flop? That's why it's considered speculative investing, because it could go belly up just as easily. Additionally, the economy relied heavily on the production and consumption of durable goods, like long-lasting, items. So by the late 1920s, the market was saturated, leading to a decline in demand. So let me give a quick example. Back then, when they built a car to last for a while. So a car you could have a car for that same car for 20, 25, 30 years. They weren't built out of clapboard like they are now. So everything is built to literally kind of destruct or to have to be replaced, every 5 to 7 years. Well, that wasn't the case then. Things were durable. They were made well. Okay. So now if you have a car, you don't have to go buy another car. That's something that you will have for many, many years. You don't have to buy another one, like a house. Typically, you don't have to keep buying them. So that's a bad business model for for capitalists, because the whole point is I need you to continue to buy or keep coming back, repeat customers. All right. So if not, then my production declines, and that means people have to be laid off, etc., etc. So it's a domino effect. Everyone who had the ability to buy cars, radios, etc. had already done so. So now there's a surplus of those items. So you made 500,000 radios and only 250,000 people can afford radios, and all 250,000 of them have radios. So what are you going to do with the other 250,000 radios? So now you're going to end up losing, money. When businesses lost money, they cut production and workers to save money. So that's, so you still have radios and everything. So as, if somebody breaks one accidentally or, I'm saying, same thing with cars, unless you have a wreck or, do something like that, you typically didn't have to replace that item. So the rate of people needing to go out and buy something again, very, very low. Okay. Because you were going to have that item for many years. All right. So let's talk about agricultural mismanagement. The agricultural sector also faced challenges with declining prices and soil exhaustion, causing financial strain for farmers. Declining prices from industrialized farming and slower demand meant farmers were unable to make payments on their rent, and the bankers were responsible by limiting the credit available to them. Now let's back that up just a tad. So with when they're talking about the soil exhaustion, so when you are with a lot of the equipment and, these new technologies for agriculture, to get more and more yield, more and more and more at a faster pace, that causes depletion of minerals in the soil. So over time, you're going to end up getting just the opposite, a lot less production. Okay, and then the quality of what you do get is much lower because, again, you've stripped a lot of the minerals out of the soil, and you're not giving it enough time, the land, any time to rest or recuperate. Okay, so President Hoover's response to the Depression, including the enactment of high tariffs, further worsened the global economic collapse. Okay, so Hoover was in president when it first started. So in 1930, amid one of the Depression's many false hopes, President Herbert Hoover reassured an audience that the Depression was over. So again, just kind of making claims and false promises and things that just were not true. Okay, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. The highest global tariff in U.S. history to protect the farmers. So between 1929 and 1932, international trade dropped from 36 billion to only 12 billion. So that's down 60%, 2/3, right? American exports fell by 78%. The world responded by raising their own tariff walls, and the global economy began to collapse. Then you have bank failures. The Federal Reserve overcorrected in their response to speculation or risky investments by raising interest rates, which is the cost of borrowing money, and tightening credit. Across the country, banks denied loans and called in debts. There were also bank runs. Bank runs are when panic spreads, Americans rush to go pull their money out of the banks before it disappeared, which, if you know, like I know, that's a smart move. When the country is kind of facing these type of situations where, things are in a free fall, if you do have any money in the bank, you might want to go get, they might wanted to get it out at that time. So that's what you call a bank run. So the banks now don't even have enough money on hand to give everybody back the money that they put into the bank, okay? Because they are using it to invest it in interest and loans and, all types of things. So the money's not really there. Panic and subsequent bank failures exacerbated the situation. In 1930, with the economy worsening and panic from the crash accelerating, 1,352 banks failed. Okay? In 1932, nearly 2,300 banks collapsed, taking personal deposits, savings, and credit along with them. All right? Overall, the Great Depression was the result of a combination of factors, including structural flaws, speculative bubbles, protectionism, and panic. Fiscal policies of the Republican business presidents, if you will, undoubtedly widened the gap between the rich and the poor and fostered a standoff over international trade. And this is another point that, kind of coming back to it, and we're talking about certain policies of, kind of what we call the business presidents, which were a lot of your Republican presidents, okay, because the Republicans were primarily in power a lot through this time period. They said, well, their practices and policies of favoring business is part of what widened the gap between the rich and the poor and kind of fostered the standoff over international trade. But these policies had also been very popular, and many believe were the reason for America's explosive growth in the 1920s. So, kind of, I guess hindsight's 2020. When you go back and you look and you say, oh, well, during the 1920s, people were making money. Now, sure, like we said, the average Americans, improved about 10%. You still had a huge disparity between what the rich were able to make during that time and what the average person was able to gain at that time. However, you saw gains kind of steadily across the board, right? So nobody was complaining about it when that part was happening. But then afterwards, they said, well, it's because of those policies that caused the depression, or the collapse, rather. Okay, so despite the problems, many Americans initially believed the economy would recover, but were ultimately faced with the devastating reality of the economic collapse. Few were willing to give up on their new standard of living, easy credit, rampant consumerism, and the problem deepened. So we were still kind of just like today. I always like to make that correlation onto what's happening, currently. We are in an actual economic depression. However, if things are still being kind of propped up, and but you see it. You see the rising prices and everything. You see the hyperinflation. You see the cost and everything from food to gas going, skyrocketing. We see these things, but we still want to continue to have, we're still just kind of paying it as long as we can, because we still want to have access to the things those luxury items that, make our lives either convenient or comfortable. We still want to take our trips, heading out to Orlando myself, right? So we still want to do these things, even in the midst of you see that there's a decline, okay? So the same thing was happening then. Herbert Hoover and the politics of the Depression. So during the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party faced public blame for their conservative approach. Hoover and his advisors assumed it would be just another bust. If those of you who remember from the first semester of U.S. history, the boom and bust cycle. So he just assumed, hey, business as usual is just a bust, and we'll rally and get right back, on the horse and keep moving here within a year. This is kind of what he thought. It was just another bust, or at least that's what he's reported to have thought. Okay. And the inevitable boom bust cycles that stretch back across America's commercial history. Yet unemployment rose for 4 years straight. New car registrations dropped by 25% and consumer spending by 20%. So again, I'm going to correlate that back to what we have going on today. Well, back then we actually produced stuff. So a lot of our jobs and economy from the employment standpoint was based on actual goods being manufactured. Well, as people didn't need the goods anymore, or couldn't afford new upgraded goods anymore, they had to start laying people off. Well, on the flip side of that, we now are in what's called a service economy, where the majority of the jobs involve not producing a good, but providing a service. Well, if people can't afford the service, then again, you have more and more unemployment, following behind that. So when you look at, like I said, it's not manufacturing, not things that we're making anymore. It's the service. So if you can't afford to continue that service, it gets cut. And that's just how that works. Okay. So Hoover's only answer was volunteerism. He asked businesses to maintain investments and employments. He encouraged charities to give to those in need. He established POUR, P-O-U-R, President's Organization for Unemployment Relief, to organize these volunteer efforts. So he's calling on the people with the money, to do things for charity, in order to kind of keep America afloat. So let's talk about associationalism. However, private charities were already overwhelmed, and the Depression scale exceeded their capacity. So even some of those organizations very early that we saw, there were a lot of women, upper and middle class women were engaged in some of those things. early on, yes, they could do drives and bake sales and all kinds of things to have some funds to help the poor, the widows, the people who passed on, to help with bereavement or burial costs. But when you're talking about a scale this large, they don't have the bandwidth for that. They don't have the capacity to address all of that. Even some of the largest organizations, like we had the Salvation Army and the Red Cross, and some of those organizations started by the Rothschilds. That's where we get Red Cross from, because Rothschild, that's actually what that means, Red Shield. Okay, so they didn't have the bandwidth to really deal with it on such a large scale. So by mid 1932, for instance, a quarter of all New York's private charities closed. They had simply run out of money. All right. In Atlanta, solvent relief charities could only provide $1.30 per week to needy families. That's it. That's as much as they can give you, is $1.30. Okay. Hoover's belief in associationalism, which is a voluntary cooperative approach, hindered his recognition of the limits of his ideology. So Americans could maintain a web of voluntary cooperative organizations dedicated to providing economic assistance and services to those in need. Businesses, the thinking went, would willingly limit harmful practices for the greater economic good. And again, those things it wasn't enough. It wasn't going to address it, what was happening from a large scale. And Americans had never seen this much, unemployment, inflation. They'd never seen such an economic downturn in the history of the country. So within, the couple hundred years that we've been around, we've never seen anything like that. Okay. Despite pleas from advisors and businessmen, Hoover resisted direct government intervention due to his limited government principles. Hoover proved insufficiently flexible to recognize the limits of his ideology. We cannot hold legislation ourselves out of a world economic depression, he told Congress in 1931. We cannot legislate ourselves out of world economic depression. So he said, look, we're not going to get out of this by whatever laws you think we're going to pass. And to be honest and to be fair to Hoover, he wasn't wrong. It's the same thing with a lot of the other social and economic issues. You cannot legislate morality, or you cannot legislate, economic downturns. You really can't do that overall, but there are things that he could have done that he ended up not doing, which is what ultimately caused him not being able to be reelected and losing to FDR. So eventually, he created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, to provide emergency loans to banks, building and loan societies, railroads, and other private industries. So once again, while the government, and specifically, the Republicans at this point, while they are saying, I'm sorry, ABC, Joe America, person, we don't have any, we're not going to do anything for you, but we will take the monies that we have to bail out big businesses. We will use the money to bail out the railroads, keep them afloat, the banks. So that didn't just happen in the 2008, mortgage bubble. If for those of you who may be aware of that, this isn't just something that just happened recently. We've been bailing out businesses for a long time, all right? Though radical in its use of the government aid and against America's laissez-faire approach, it mostly benefited who? The rich. So once again, the folks on the bottom, they aren't going to get anything. They're not getting any help. Okay? So when we talk about all of this 2,300 banks being closed, the people who lost their money are the middle and lower class people, the working class folks. Lost whatever savings they had. So the $300 that Mr. Jones had saved up, or the $500 that Mrs. Wistenhoff had, all that is gone, and that was devastating to these individuals. These companies, there's arguments that they really didn't lose anything, because many of them knew what was coming down the pipeline. They shifted money, moved money around, and again, you've got the government as your candy store. They're going to still just go ahead and print it out and restore you. Like I said, so this just really just devastated the American people, though. So New York Congressman and later mayor of NYC, Fiorello LaGuardia, called it a millionaire's dole, and he was not wrong. That was the millionaire's dole. The money, they'll roll it out to keep the rich, but like I said, the poor get nothing. The lived experiences of the Great Depression. So let's talk about it. During the Great Depression, many Americans faced economic collapse, unemployment, and declining wages. Like I said, even people who working poor, or working class, and even to the lower and middle class people, they might have had a few $1,000s as a safety net, which was significant at that time, in the bank account. Well, like I said, when you lose all that and you're unemployed, you don't even have those funds anymore to call on to kind of keep you afloat until either to ride it out till things got better, or to even start up something new, or just kind of take care of yourself for a while. That was gone. That safety net was gone. Okay, families struggled to make ends meet, often resorting to borrowing from friends, relatives, and local stores. But it wasn't their fault. Markets crashed through no fault of their own. Workers were plunged into poverty because of impersonal forces for which they shared no responsibility. So sometimes there's the idea that you're going in debt, or you're unable to meet your responsibility. You've gotten things on credit or whatever, and that is to some degree. So, well, you're the one who got everything on credit, and now you can't afford to pay for it, because you lost your job or whatever. Yes, that is a good significant piece of it, but not everybody was using credit. When I bought my first house, true story. When I bought my first house, and I'm not rich, but I paid cash for it. I bought it because I kind of grew up with my grandmother and my great grandmother, who really kind of instilled in my head, if you can't pay cash for it, you can't afford it. And that was literally the thought process that I had for many, many years. Most of my cars, I would just save up a little coin and just go buy a car, because not that I was afraid of credit, but it was like, well, why would I want to create bills that you don't know what can possibly happen? So this was the thought process of a lot of people at that time period. And so not everybody was kind of caught into the credit vortex. Okay, so however, these resources were eventually exhausted. Middle and working class Americans might rely on disappearing credit at neighborhood stores, default or missed payments on utility bills, or skip meals. However, these resources were eventually exhausted, leading to the need for public assistance, which quickly became overwhelmed. So everybody was trying to go get some type of welfare at that time. And I find it interesting that from a social standpoint, we are quick to kind of demonize or look down at people who get welfare, get assistance or whatever. But people don't understand that the majority of the welfare money is paid to the rich. The majority of welfare payments go to the elite, not to the poor person. So that's always an interesting point. But desperate individuals formed shanty towns called Hoovervilles and relied on bread lines and peddling to survive. The idea of the male breadwinner was always a fiction for poor Americans, and during the crisis, women and young children entered the workforce. Women were often the first to be laid off or furloughed, meaning, suspended, laid off, or whatever. Married women were let go first under the assumption their husbands worked. Single women were kept longer to provide for themselves. And as we know, when we start getting into the racial divides on that, much of the same happens. So we're going to talk about racist unemployment. So non-white Americans also faced significant hardships, being the last hired and first fired during economic downturns. So many black people who just kind of got into the workforce or were just now able to even secure employment, or Mexican Americans or even Native Americans who were not necessarily on reservations, last ones to be hired, the first ones to be let go. All right. The Negro was born in depression, one black pensioner told interviewer Studs Terkel. It didn't mean too much to him. The Great American Depression only became official when it hit the white man. So it's really kind of very telling that the conditions that the majority of black Americans lived in was already what they were living in, the Depression, long before the rest of the world came into the Depression. So that was just kind of everyday life. And when you read a lot of the writings and research that's done with African Americans through this time period, some will say they didn't even know that there was a depression because there was no difference for them. It was still the fight and scratch to survive every day. The Great Depression had a profound impact on non-white individuals, families, and communities, causing widespread suffering and deprivation. But like I said, for the majority of blacks, they didn't even, or even Mexicans or low income, they didn't know. It was just the same fight for struggle to survive as always. So in 1932, with the national unemployment average hovering around 25%, black unemployment reached as high as 50%. So, we definitely had more unemployment, at that time. And that's when it was like, oh, that's a little bit different. That was where, you did see some different, some lowering or difference in the money flow in our communities. But like I said, overall, we were already fighting and struggling. So that was just maybe just another piece of it that ended up coming in. So while even black workers who kept their jobs saw their already low wages were being cut. So again, even, that was part and parcel to what we dealt with anyway. So moving on to migration and the Great Depression. So we talk about the Dust Bowl. Severe droughts from Texas to the Dakotas from 1932 to 1936, combined with years of agricultural mismanagement, led to dust storms. Without rain, the exposed fertile topsoil turned to dust. Without sod or windbreakers such as trees, rolling winds churned the dust into massive storms that blotted out the sky, choked settlers and livestock. Okay. Dirt rained across the region and as far east as Washington, D.C., New England, and ships on the Atlantic Ocean. So that dust was nothing to play with. Again, you'd been over-tilling the yard. There weren't any minerals being held in it. Then on top of that, a severe drought. All your entire top layers of the earth was just turned to straight dust. Okay, it was just dirt. And then as the winds went through and there was nothing to stop it, like I said, there were no trees or mountains or anything to cut it. So just dust and dust storms. All right. The crisis heightened the need for conservation and devastated the region's farmers, leading many to migrate west to California in search of jobs. Oklahoma lost 440,000 people, or a full 18.4% of its 1930 population, to out-migration. people were like, deuce it out. I can't do it. There's nothing here. You can't grow anything. The dust storms. You can't even have like a little farm with some cattle, because the dust storms were choking and killing, your chickens and ducks and everything else. So they said, they were leaving. So that's a very, very huge and significant migration. Many leaving Oklahoma, heading further west into California. So talk about migrant workers. So Dorothea Lange's migrant mother became one of the most enduring images of the Dust Bowl in the ensuing westward exodus. So really interesting book there, The Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange. It captured at a migrant farming camp in Nipomo, California in 1936. So she's a mother of 7. She moved to the Golden State in search of work in the fertile farmlands of California's Central Valley, where the rain still fell. Okies, as they were disparagingly or derogatorily called, were migrant workers traveling the country in search of rumored jobs they'd heard about. So you've got all of these very poor whites moving from Oklahoma, heading towards California to work, as migrant workers. Well, that's going to cause some clashing and some issues socially when you are met with your Mexican migrants, who that's the work they traditionally have been doing, or poor blacks, or even some of your poor Chinese immigrants. So we'll get to some of those clashes in a bit. But by 1932, sociologists were estimating that millions of men left their families in search of jobs and money to send home. Popular magazines and newspapers were filled with stories of homeless youth and veterans looking for work any way they could. The most famous of these stories is John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. I think they even have that as a movie now. That was done in 1939. Let's talk about the Okies just a little bit more. State and local officials imposed barriers on migration, making it difficult for newcomers to receive relief or find jobs. In 1935, 1936, California, Florida, and Colorado established border blockades to block poor migrants from their states and reduce competition with local residents for jobs. So again, that goes back to, like I said, there was already going to be some issues with the folks who had been doing that work there already. A billboard outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, informed potential migrants that there were no jobs in California and warned them to keep out. Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath drew attention to the plight of Depression-era migrants, and a committee was set up. Select Committee to investigate the interstate migration of destitute citizens. So let me say that again. The Select Committee to investigate the interstate migration of destitute citizens was set up to hear about the problem, but it came too late. World War II had already begun. All right. So when we're talking about foreign workers, the Saturday Evening Post warned that foreign immigrants were compelled to accept employment on any terms and conditions offered would exacerbate the economic crisis. So Hoover instructed immigration officers to deny visa applications to most laborers or artisans who were likely to become public charges. So if we believe that you coming over here, you're not going to really be able to add anything to our situation, but may become a liability, we're not even going to give you a visa. All right. So between 1930 and 1932, 54,000 people were deported. An additional 44,000 deportable aliens left voluntarily. So you have about 100,000 people being removed from the country. Okay. Mexican immigrants were hit primarily hard, same as today, as relief organizations worked with federal agents to deport many back to Mexico. Some went voluntarily while others were forced. In Los Angeles, parts of Arizona, and Texas, vigilantes often rounded up Mexican laborers, some who even had citizenships. It's not a whole lot like what was going on down in California here a couple months ago, right? Right after the inauguration. And put them on buses and trains to cross back into Mexico. Now, once again, some of the folks they're grabbing and snatching and rounding up were American citizens. Okay, just because you had a Z in your last name and spoke Spanish, perhaps as your native tongue, didn't mean that you were not an American citizen. So, same thing that we've been witnessing happening here over the last few months. But from 1930 to 1940, the American-born population living in Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas fell from 616,998 to 377,433. So cut in half, basically. So the Mexican-born population living in those areas diminished by half. Okay, the bonus army. In the summer of 1932, a group of over 15,000 unemployed World War I veterans and their families gathered in Washington, D.C. to demand immediate payment of cash bonuses that were originally scheduled for 1945. These veterans set up a tent city called Bonus Army across the Potomac River, similar to other Hooverville camps of homeless and unemployed Americans in the country. While there were billions for bankers, there was nothing for the poor, they complained. President Hoover opposed the bill due to concerns about the impact on the federal budget, and the Senate eventually voted it down. So again, okay, you're in the Depression, all this is going on, and the veterans, the people who've been fighting for the country, right, the real patriots, are out here starving, and you have nothing for them, but you have billions of dollars to give to the rich. Tell you, the more things change, the more they stay the same. All right? So while most of the bonus army left Washington, many stayed to continue their advocacy, and Hoover deemed them insurrectionalists and ordered them to leave. So once again, if you stand up for yourself against the tyranny that sometimes comes through our government, let's just be honest, you are absolutely considered a terrorist, and you're an insurrectionalist, you are crazy, you are, anti-American, etc., etc., etc. Now, these people, like I said, were on the front lines. They were out there making the world safe for democracy, right? They were out there doing everything that was showing that they were good, patriot, red-blooded American, apple pie eating, Americans just a few years ago. But now we need help, and you don't know me. Now I'm an insurrectionalist, and you are forcing me to leave empty-handed. All right? So removing the bonus army. So let's talk about that. General Douglas MacArthur, accompanied by local police, infantry, cavalry, tanks, and a machine gun squadron, stormed the tent city and routed the bonus army. You just sent that much heavy artillery after patriots, after men who served the country. Make it make sense. Troops chased down men and women, tear-gassed children, and torched the shantytown, which is a poorly constructed town, usually on the outskirts of cities. 2 marchers were shot and killed, and a baby was killed by tear gas. Yeah. The media coverage for this event highlighted Hoover's insensitivity towards suffering Americans and further damaged his presidency. Yeah, that didn't go over very well. The very political machine that you had been using in the propaganda to push the idea of, making the world safe for democracy, so forth and so on. And this is what you do to your own veterans right here on American soil. And we're talking, and this didn't have anything to do with people of color. These are particularly, white veterans with their wives and their children. Okay, the media coverage, so they did, like I said, they used the same media to bring down Hoover because that didn't go well. His overall unwillingness to address widespread economic problems and his repeated platitudes about returning prosperity condemned his presidency. Americans had so far found little relief from Washington, but they were still looking for it. And what do they get? Let's talk about it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the first New Deal. Few presidential elections in modern American history have been more consequential than that of 1932. Voters overthrew Hoover in a landslide victory for the Democratic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which is Teddy Roosevelt's cousin. All right. Franklin Delano Roosevelt came from a wealthy family tree, graduated from Harvard, served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I before becoming governor of New York. He was diagnosed with polio, even though that FDR became a paraplegic, but encouraged and assisted by his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, Teddy's niece. He re-entered politics. So polio is the polio virus is a disease that destroys nerve cells in the spinal cord. It can cause paraplegia or loss of leg function. Dr. Jonas Salk, 1950s, allegedly created a vaccine that has eradicated the virus in all areas besides Afghanistan and Pakistan, which there's a lot to talk about in that, but that's not what this particular class is about, so we're not going to go into it. But let's get right back to it. Roosevelt versus Hoover, 1932. In his DNC acceptance speech, because again, he is a Democrat, all right? He introduced the term New Deal to describe his program to address the Great Depression. As governor of New York, he had pioneered public works projects to use state money to put people back to work. This would be a hallmark of his policy. Roosevelt proposed job programs, public work projects, higher wages, shorter hours, old age pensions, unemployment insurance, farm subsidies, banking regulations, and lower tariffs. Hoover warned that such a program represented, quote, the total abandonment of every principle upon which the government and the American system is founded, unquote. Hoover warned that it reeked of European communism and that, quote, the so-called New Deal would destroy the very foundations of the American system of life. So this is a very, very interesting election because at this point, the vast majority, almost 100% of your black votership was Republican, because that's the party of Lincoln, right? And we know that the Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats, have always been very violently opposed to blacks, Mexicans, Native Americans, even some of your Eastern and Southern Europeans as well. So those groups, by and large, avoided Democrats like the plague, which is why the Republican Party had dominated, politics the entire, since the Civil War, for the most part, that's why. So the Democrats never really had a leg to stand on because of their connections to things like the KKK and, a lot of these, say, kind of anti-social organizations. Well, here comes, since Hoover mismanaged things so horribly, people were saying, let's go ahead and give those Dixiecrats, a chance. I mean, if they can pull us out of this depression, hey, well, we might have to deal with a few more lynchings, but hey, we can overall come out of this depression. So a lot of folks switched over to the Democratic Party at that time, who had been staunch Republicans, primarily the Black American community, which until this last election with the Trumpster, 98% of African Americans voted solidly as Democrat, starting with FDR in 1932. So it's a huge departure when you see so many blacks switching, kind of clicking over, over the past couple elections, really, to support not just so much Trump, but to support the Republican Party, moving back to the Republican side. All right. So Roosevelt wins, as a Democrat. Roosevelt won more counties than any previous president, period. The people had spoken. It was a landslide. He mopped the floor with Hoover. Okay. He spent the months between his election and inauguration traveling, planning, and assembling a team of advisors that he called the famous Brain Trust of academics and experts to help him formulate a plan of attack, right? On March 4th, 1933, in his first inaugural address, Roosevelt famously declared, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." All right, unquote. Banking first, Roosevelt took swift action upon assuming office, stabilizing the banking system. Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday and promised to make banking safe again for the public. In his first fireside chat on the radio, FDR encouraged Americans to trust the banks and their government again. So again, something else that really is very key for Roosevelt is that now you have the radio, and remember, now people are sitting around the radio getting that information, connecting to people, connecting to sports, etc. He very ingeniously uses something he called the fireside chat. Like, I'm just here in your house right with you, Mr. and Mrs. Joe Public, right by the fire, and I'm talking to you as a friend. And that was overwhelmingly successful, okay? The Glass-Steagall Banking Act instituted a federal deposit insurance system through the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which we call FDIC, and barred the mixing of commercial and investment banking. If you deposit your money in a bank and the bank fails, closed, or lost it, the government would pay you back up to $2,500. So I think it's like $100,000 now, but that's the point. So that you can put your money in the bank and be assured that if anything happens, the government will at least give you back this amount. So if you've got $3,000 and you have it in the account and it goes under, the government will give you back $2,500 of that. So you may lose $500, but you still get a portion of your money back, okay? Today, the FDIC protects up to $250. I was thinking over 100. I knew it was over 100. But it says $250,000 in bank deposits, okay? So let's talk about the first 100 days. Roosevelt and his congressional allies focused especially on relief for suffering Americans. Congress debated, amended, and passed what Roosevelt proposed. As one historian noted, the president directed the entire operation like a seasoned field general. So the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, employed young men on conservation and reforestation projects. Many of the trails and roads in the national parks were done by the CCC. Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, F-E-R-A, provided direct cash assistance to state relief agencies struggling to care for the unemployed. The Tennessee Valley Authority, so TVA, built a series of hydroelectric dams along the Tennessee River as part of a comprehensive program to economically develop a chronically depressed region. So let's talk about alphabet soup. Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA, aimed to raise the prices of agricultural commodities and hence farmers' income by offering cash incentives to voluntarily limit farm production or decrease supply, thereby raising prices. So I'm going to subsidize and pay you, Mr. and Mrs. Farmer, to not produce as much. Same thing they're doing today. They've been doing. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, suspended antitrust laws to allow businesses to establish codes that would coordinate prices, regulate production levels, and establish conditions for employment to curtail cutthroat competition. In exchange for these exemptions, businesses agreed to provide reasonable wages and hours, and child labor and other workers to the right to unionize. They were also given a Blue Eagle, if I can get it out, a Blue Eagle insignia to display, so Americans knew that doing business there helped the economy. So that was another kind of incentive. Excuse me. The Civil Works Administration, or CWA, and later Works Progress Administration, WPA, aimed to provide relief and employment opportunities. The Public Works Administration, the PWA, so that's what we're talking about, alphabet soup, y'all, because all these acronyms, I'm going to say it like this. Go through and just take a look at all of them and be familiar with them, because there are quite a few. I'm not going to go through each and every one. So let's talk about the New Deal in the South. The impact of the initial New Deal legislation was particularly evident in the South, which was already burdened by poverty and the Great Depression. So the South had the lowest per capita, or meaning per person, income in the country, and its farmers were stuck in low profit crops. Despite efforts to boost industry, the South remained low-waged and low-skilled. At the time of the crash, Southerners were already underpaid, underfed, and undereducated when compared with other regions of the country. The New Deal programs aimed to address these issues, but the benefits often bypassed the most vulnerable Southern farmers. While the AAA increased cotton prices, it pushed landless farm workers off the land. It did not help tenant farmers or sharecroppers who needed help the most. So the poorest people still don't get the assistance. However, the NRA brought positive changes by encouraging higher wages, better conditions, and protecting workers' rights to unionize. So the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act set a national minimum wage of 25 cents an hour, eventually raising it to 40 cents an hour. The minimum wage, brought Southern wages within the reach of Northern standards. All right, so take a look again at the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. Let's go, jump down. Let's hear. We're going to calling out racism. Initially, Roosevelt courted conservative or racist Southern Democrats by not pushing race issues. But by the end of the his second term, he had won the support of enough non-Southern voters that he felt confident in confronting some of the region's most glaring inequalities. A report on economic conditions in the South was a New Deal pamphlet denouncing the racial and economic hardships wrought by the Southern economy. He suggested that the New Deal could save the South and thereby spur a national recovery. Very interesting, because absolutely a staunch Democrat, which tended to or have historically gone hand in hand with racist politics and oppression politics, supporting Jim Crow, etc., etc. What we're going to find is that under FDR, he is the first president to invite, through the front door, a black person to visit the White House. And that black person was none other than Booker T. Washington. All right, so voices of protest. In the midst of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt's relief programs were initially conservative and cautious. Despite fascism and socialism taking hold in Europe, Roosevelt's New Deal demonstrated a clear reluctance to radically reform the economy. Still, some called for more dramatic changes. Like Senator Huey Long, a flamboyant Democrat from Louisiana, was perhaps the most important voice of protest. Long proposed a Share Our Wealth program in which the federal government would confiscate the assets of the extremely wealthy and redistribute them to the less well-off through guaranteed minimum incomes. His quote, "How many men ever went to a barbecue and will let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat?" So, they're saying, look, again, that 10% that's coming in, taking 90% of the wealth, leaving nothing, let's just take it from them and redistribute it. So kind of almost a Robin Hood approach, right? Over 27,000 Share the Wealth clubs sprang up across the nation, but his crusade ended in late 1935 when he was assassinated on the floor of the Louisiana state capitol. Again, freedom of speech. You can say what you want to say as long as it doesn't go against the powers that be. All right. So some of the critics, Francis Townsend, a former doctor and public health official from California, promoted a plan for old age pensions or retirement funds, which could provide economic security for the elderly and with retirements, new jobs for the young. Reverend Charles Coughlin, a Detroit priest and radio personality, gained a following by making virulent or very bitter criticisms, anti-Semitic attacks on Roosevelt, calling for state-run economics. Now, we are at the hour for this part, but I tell you there's some more good stuff going on. I'm going to stop this right now and pop over, go ahead and get this one loaded, and then I'll give the last half because I tell you there's a lot more in store. All right, see you guys in a little bit.